So physiologically, what we have is a distinction between the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. Both of them will start out in the central nervous system, and both will have two neurons in the circuit. The sympathetic nervous system will arise from the central nervous system with a neuron called the preganglionic neuron. So this is a preganglionic. It will synapse with a postganglionic. Now, there are two, but what will happen in the sympathetic nervous system, you'll have a very short preganglionic neuron and a very long postganglionic neuron. And it is the postganglionic neuron that will synapse with the target tissue, such as a smooth muscle. So this one will be the postganglionic. Likewise, the parasympathetic nervous system will have two neurons in a circuit, and it will differ in this way. The preganglionic neuron will have a long axon, and the postganglionic neuron will have a very short axon. So again, we have in the parasympathetics a preganglionic and a postganglionic. Now, to keep track of the physiology, you're going to have to know this configuration. Again, a very short preganglionic sympathetic and a very long postganglionic sympathetic, and vice versa for the parasympathetic nervous system. So we also have to recognize that just like any nerve to nerve or nerve to muscle transmission of neurotransmitters, you must have a receptor or receptors on the postsynaptic membrane. But now we usually call it the postganglionic receptors. Again, postganglionic receptors in both the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. It is the exact same thing as the postsynaptic receptors that we've talked about before. What complicates the autonomic nervous system is we have different neurotransmitters. The easiest one to learn, however, is going to be acetylcholine. All preganglionic autonomic nerve fibers or nerve cells will secrete acetylcholine at the synapse. And this is the synapse between the preganglionic and postganglionic neurons, both in sympathetic and parasympathetic. The easiest postganglionic neuron to learn would be the acetylcholine secreted by the postganglionic parasympathetic nerve. So, in the parasympathetic nervous system, the preganglionic nerve secretes acetylcholine, and there are receptors for that acetylcholine on the postganglionic nerve or neuron, and that postganglionic neuron will secrete acetylcholine and then have receptors on the target tissues. It's not quite as easy in the sympathetic nervous system. On the postganglionic neuron, it will secrete norepinephrine. So that's our first difference. In the sympathetic nervous system, the preganglionic short neuron will secrete acetylcholine. The postganglionic long neuron will have receptors for that acetylcholine, but then the postganglionic nerve or neuron will secrete norepinephrine, and the norepinephrine will have to have receptors on its target tissue. To complicate things further, there are subtypes of both norepinephrine receptors and acetylcholine receptors. Let's just cover the acetylcholine receptors. Again, the acetylcholine receptors are on the postganglionic neurons of both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. The type of receptors that receive the acetylcholine between the preganglionic and postganglionic neurons are nicotinic receptors. They're called nicotinic receptors. So nicotinic receptors receive the acetylcholine between the preganglionic and postganglionic neurons of the entire autonomic nervous system. What we have then is nicotinic receptors on the postganglionic cell body membranes that will receive the acetylcholine of both the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. We have, however, on the postganglionic side of the parasympathetic, the target tissue will have muscarinic acetylcholine receptors. Now what we'll find in the future is that the acetylcholine binding to the nicotinic receptors will be stimulatory, and we'll also find that the acetylcholine binding to the muscarinic may be stimulatory or inhibitory depending on where it is. Likewise, the norepinephrine will bind to receptors called adrenergic receptors, and there are many subtypes of those, and some of those are stimulatory and some are inhibitory.